Welcome to The Explainer. Today we're doing something a little different. We're stepping into a theological courtroom for a completely impartial, fascinating logical audit of the Nicene-Chalcedonian doctrine. We're drawing from a really rigorous source text that puts 17 centuries of tradition on trial, and it does so not with emotion, but with unyielding, strictly applied logic. We'll be examining the author's detailed case for what they call the begotten Son, dismantling the traditional creed piece by piece, and then looking at the scriptural alternative they propose. It's an absolutely incredible intellectual journey, so let's get right into it.
Okay, let's dive into this. The author kicks things off by posing a really foundational logical question about the traditional catechism's core claims. When the creed states the Father is God, the Son is God, and the Holy Spirit is God, while simultaneously insisting they are not each other and that there is only one God, what exactly does the word "is" actually mean in that sentence? As the author points out, grammar and philosophy only give us two options for that tiny little word, and both lead to massive logical problems for the traditional doctrine.
Here is our trial docket for today's explainer. We'll start with the core contradiction, then move into testing the escape routes. After that, we'll contrast a self-existent God versus a derived Son. Then we'll step into cross-examination, and finally, look at the confession. We are going to systematically follow the author's step-by-step logical breakdown of this highly complex theology.
Section 1. The core logical contradiction.
Now, what's really fascinating about this slide is how the author argues that standard logic forces us right off one of two cliffs. If "is" means identity, that's option A. Like saying Clark Kent is Superman, we hit a brick wall of mathematical contradiction. The iron rule of logic says if A equals C and B equals C, then A absolutely must equal B. So, if the Father is God and the Son is God, then the Father must be the Son. But the creed explicitly denies that. So theologians try option B, predication. This means having a certain property, like saying Peter is human. But think about it. If you have three distinct individuals who each fully possess the divine nature, you logically have three gods. That's outright polytheism. According to the author's audit, standard grammar dictates there literally is no third option.
Section 2. Testing 4 escape routes.
So, how do defenders of the tradition reply to this? The author methodically walks us through 4 rescue attempts that brilliant theologians have tried throughout history and points out the heavy logical toll each one charges. Escape route 1 is relative identity, but the author notes this literally requires rewriting the universal rules of logic just to fit this one specific theological case. Next, escape 2 is social Trinitarianism, viewing God as a society of three minds. But the author, along with plenty of opposing theologians, points out this is essentially just tritheism with good manners. Then escape 3 reduces the persons to subsistent relations. The problem here? Abstract relations cannot love, act, or pray like the Son actually does in the source text, and that brings us to escape 4, mystery.
So, the crucial point here is the author's razor-sharp distinction between two entirely different kinds of mystery. A mystery of scale, like God's eternal nature or creating the entire universe from nothing, is completely honorable. It legitimately exceeds human comprehension. But a mystery of contradiction, asserting that something is 3 and 1 at the exact same time and in the exact same way, defies logic itself. The author argues that calling a logical failure a mystery is just a selective excuse. It's like a sword the tradition draws to defeat rival theories, but conveniently sheathes to protect its own logical gaps.
Section 3, self-existent versus derived Son.
To really grasp the author's alternative, we first need to define a vital philosophical term, aseity. Aseity means absolute self-existence. It means having your being entirely from yourself, dependent on absolutely nothing and no one. This, the author stresses, is the ultimate watermark of true deity. The one true God is the unconditioned condition of everything else. But here we find yet another logical collision within the traditional creed. The author points out that the famous phrase, true God from true God, is entirely self-refuting. Why? Because the very definition of true God implies aseity, being underived, but the word begotten literally means to receive your being from another. You simply cannot logically be a self-existent being who is simultaneously dependent on a source for your existence. If the Son's deity comes from the Father, it is derivative, and a derivative deity cannot, by definition, be the absolute self-existent one. Instead of a co-equal, underived person, the author relies strictly on the text to show a fundamentally different portrait. The Son is consistently portrayed as the derived Son. He was brought forth before all ages. He's the firstborn of creation, and he is the agent through whom everything was made. Just look at the verbs constantly used for the Son. He is given life, given authority, given glory. The Son is always the eternal receiver, dependent on a source, and never the unoriginated source himself.
Section 4. Cross-examining the objections.
Any good trial has to face the cross-examination, right? So let's take on the absolute strongest objections to the author's logical dismantle. The author presents the most famous one head-on. When Thomas sees the risen Jesus, he exclaims, "My Lord and my God." So how does the author's logical framework survive this text? If Jesus is literally called God, doesn't that immediately prove the traditional doctrine?
Well, the author's rebuttal is firmly grounded in the immediate context. Just 8 verses earlier, the risen Jesus literally says, "I ascend to my Father and your Father, and to my God and your God." The author argues that Thomas applying the title God to Jesus actually reflects a representational, delegated deity. It's a highly honored title given to God's supreme agent, a usage Jesus himself actually defends earlier in the text. And it does this without breaking the strict logic of monotheism, that there is only one true, unoriginate God.
And that brings us to the next massive objection, the early church's clear, documented worship of Jesus. Let all the angels of God worship him. If you worship Jesus, doesn't that inherently make him the one unoriginate God? The author tackles this by looking closely at exactly why the text says Jesus is worshipped.
And this brilliantly illustrates the author's counter-argument. The source text shows that worshiping the Son perfectly fits monotheism because of its specific internal logic. Think about it. This worship is explicitly commanded by the Father. It is granted as a reward for the cross. It is exercised over a delegated authority. And ultimately, as the scriptures say, every knee bows to the glory of God the Father. The worship terminates upward. It's not about two rival unoriginate sources. It's a king honored on the Lord's own throne, by the Lord's own explicit command.
Section 5. The final positive confession.
So we've dismantled the contradictions and faced the strongest objections. What structural theology actually remains after the author deconstructs the traditional creed? Well, the author's foundational premise leaves us with exactly the number one, a mathematically coherent monotheism featuring exactly one true, self-existent, unoriginate God, the Father.
Let's move to our ideas and see how this builds into the author's reconstructed, fully logical theology. Step 1. There is exactly one unoriginated God, the Father. Step 2. He brought forth one uniquely begotten Son before all ages. Step 3. This Son acts as the divine agent through whom all things are made. Step 4. Even at the very end of time, the Son forever submits to the Father, handing the kingdom back so that God may be all in all. Every single step, the author claims, is logically clean and directly supported by the text.
Now you might be wondering, why does this logical audit even matter practically? Well, the author argues it literally rescues the moral achievement of the cross. If Jesus is the untemptable, undying, self-existent God, his sacrifice becomes this confusing logical paradox where his divine nature fundamentally cannot die or be tempted. But if he is a truly derived Son, then his temptation was real. His submission in Gethsemane was to a true other. His death was genuine, and his resurrection by the Father was a real, universe-altering triumph. It brings the story of the gospel back into sharp, emotional focus.
Which leaves us with a really profound thought to end on today. Does authentic reverence actually require us to embrace a mathematical and logical contradiction? Or does true revelation make the saving truth logically clear enough for anyone to grasp? The author of this explainer source material firmly believes that God doesn't hide the truth behind an unsolvable paradox, but rather offers a genuine, logically coherent revelation of a Father in his devoted Son. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. I hope this logical audit has given you a whole new perspective to consider,